Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody, we recently celebrated our 2500th edition of Keen On. Some people suggest I'm mad. I think I probably am to do so many shows. And just over a little, just wasn't much more than a year ago that we actually celebrated our 2000th show, featuring one of America's most distinguished historians, Adam Hochschild. And I'm thrilled that Adam is joining us again a year later. Of course, he's the author of American Midnight, The Great War, A Violent Peace, and Democracy's Forgotten Crisis. This was his last book. He's the author of many other books. He's now working on a book on the Great Depression. He's joining us from his home in Berkeley, California. Adam, to borrow a famous phrase or remix a famous phrase, a year is a long time in American history.
That's true, Andrew. I think this past year, or actually this past 100 days or so, has been a very long and very difficult time in American history that we all saw coming to some degree, but I don't think we realized it would be as extreme and as rapid as it has been.
Your book, Adam, of course, American Midnight, A Great War, A Violent Peace, and Democracy's Forgotten Crisis, is perhaps the most prescient warning. When you researched it, you were saying before we went live that your books usually take you between 4 and 5 years. So you couldn't really have planned for this, although I guess you began writing and researching American Midnight during the Trump 1.0 regime. Did you write it as a warning to something like is happening today in America?
Well, I did start writing it and did most of the work on it during Trump's first term in office. So I was very struck by the parallels. And, you know, they're there in plain sight for everybody to see. There are various dark currents that run through this country of ours. Nativism, threats to deport troublemakers, politicians stirring up violent feelings against immigrants, vigilante violence. All those things have been with us for a long time. And I've always been fascinated by that period, 1917 to 21, when they surged to the surface in a very, very nasty way. That was the subject of the book. Naturally, I hoped we wouldn't have to go through anything like that again, but here we are, definitely going through it again.
Yeah, and you wrote a lovely piece earlier this month for the Washington Post. America was at its Trumpiest 100 years ago. Here's how to prevent the worst. What did you mean by Trumpiest, Adam? I'm not sure if you came up with that title, but I know you like the term. You begin the essay. What was the Trumpiest period in American life before Donald Trump?
Well, I didn't invent the word, but I certainly did use it in the piece. What I meant by that is that when you look at this period just over 100 years ago, and I'm talking about 1917 to 1921, Woodrow Wilson's second term in office, two things happened in 1917 that kicked off a kind of hysteria in this country. One was that Wilson asked the American Congress to declare war on Germany, which it promptly did. And when a country enters a major war, especially a world war, and then it was the largest war the world had ever yet seen, it sets off a kind of hysteria. And then that was redoubled some months later when the country received news of the Russian Revolution, and many people in the establishment in America were afraid the Russian Revolution might come to the United States. So a number of things happened. One was that there was a total hysteria against all things German. There were bonfires of German books all around the country. People would take German books out of libraries, schools, college and university libraries, and burn them in the street. 19 such bonfires in Ohio alone. You can see pictures of it on the internet. There was hysteria against the German language. I heard about this from my father as I was growing up because his father was a Jewish immigrant from Germany. They lived in New York City. They spoke German around the family dinner table, but they were terrified of doing so on the street because you could get beaten up for that. Several states passed laws against speaking German in public or speaking German on the telephone. Eminent professors declared that German was a barbaric language. So there was that kind of hysteria. Then, as soon as the United States declared war, Wilson pushed the Espionage Act through Congress, this draconian law, which essentially gave the government the right to lock up anybody who said something that was taken to be against the war. And they used this law in a devastating way. During those 4 years, roughly 1,000 Americans spent a year or more in jail, and a much larger number, shorter periods in jail, solely for things that they wrote or said. I don't mean that nobody did anything violent during those years, because there was violence, but these were people who were political prisoners sent to jail simply for something they wrote or said. The most famous of them was Eugene Debs, many times the socialist candidate for president. He'd gotten 6% of the popular vote in 1912. And in 1918, for giving an anti-war speech from a park bandstand in Ohio, he was sent to prison for 10 years. And he was still in prison 2 years after the war ended in November 1920, when he pulled more than 900,000 votes for president from his jail cell in the federal penitentiary in Atlanta. So that was one phase of the repression, political prisoners. Another was vigilante violence. The government itself, the Department of Justice, chartered a vigilante group, something called the American Protective League, which went around roughing up people that it thought were evading the draft, beating up people at anti-war rallies, arresting people with citizens arrest who didn't have their proper draft papers on them, holding them for hours or sometimes for days until they could produce the right paperwork. So that was going on.
Yeah, I remember, Adam, you have a very graphic description of some of this violence in American Midnight. There was a story of, was it a union leader in the book?
Well, there is so much violence that happened during that time. I begin the book with a graphic description of vigilantes raiding an office of the Wobblies, the industrial.
Yeah, that was the story.
In Tulsa, Oklahoma, taking a bunch of Wobblies out into the prairie at night, stripping them, whipping them fiercely, and then tarring and feathering them and firing shotguns over their heads so they would run off into the prairie at night. And they did. Those guys were lucky because they survived. Other people were killed by this vigilante violence. And the final thing about that period, which I would mention, is the press censorship. The Espionage Act gave the Postmaster General the power to declare any publication in the United States unmailable. And for a newspaper or magazine that was trying to reach a national audience, the only way you could do so was through the US mail, because there was no internet then, no radio, no TV, no other way of getting your publication to somebody. And this put some 75 newspapers and magazines that the government didn't like out of business. It, in addition, censored 300 or 400 specific issues of other publications as well. So that's why I feel this is all a very dark period of American life. Ironically, that press censorship operation, because it was run by the Postmaster General, who, by the way, loved being chief censor, it was run out of the building that was then the post office headquarters in Washington, which 100 years later became the Trump International Hotel. And for $4,000 a night, you could stay in the Postmaster General's suite.
You, Adam, the First World War is a subject you're very familiar with. In addition to American Midnight, you wrote To End All Wars, A Story of Loyalty and Rebellion, 1914 to 18, which was another very successful of your historical recreations. Many countries around the world experienced this turbulence, the violence. Of course, we had fascism in the 20s in Europe, and later in the 30s as well. America has a long history of violence. You talk about the violence after the First World War or after the Declaration. But I was just in Montgomery, Alabama, went to the lynching museum there, which is considerably troubling. I'm sure you've been there. You're not necessarily a comparative political scientist, Adam, but how does America, in its paranoia during the war and its clampdown on press freedom, on its violence, on its attempt to create an authoritarian political system, how does it compare to other democracies? Is some of this stuff uniquely American, or is it a similar development around the world?
Well, you see similar pressures almost any time that a major country is involved in a major war. Wars are never good for civil liberties. The First World War, which was to stick with that period of comparison, was a time that saw strong anti-war movements in all of the warring countries, in Germany and Britain and Russia. There were people who understood at the time that this war was going to remake the world for the worse in every way, which indeed it did, and who refused to fight. There were 800 conscientious objectors jailed in Russia, and Russia did not have much freedom of expression to begin with. In Germany, many distinguished people on the left, like Rosa Luxemburg, were sent to jail for most of the war. Britain was an interesting case because I think they had a much longer established tradition of free speech than did countries on the continent. It goes way back, and it's a distinguished and wonderful tradition. They were also worried for the first 2.5, 3 years of the war before the United States entered, that if they cracked down too hard on their anti-war movement, it would upset people in the United States, which they were desperate to draw into the war on their side. Nonetheless, there were 6,000 conscientious objectors who were sent to jail in England. There was intermittent censorship of anti-war publications, although some were able to publish some of the time. There were many distinguished Britons, such as Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, who later won the Nobel Prize, sent to jail for 6 months for his opposition to the war. So some of this happened all over. But I think in the United States, especially with these vigilante groups, it took a more violent form because, remember, the country at that time was only a few decades away from these frontier wars with the Indians. And the westward expansion of the United States during the 19th century, the western expansion of white settlement, was an enormously bloody business that was, almost genocidal for the Native Americans. Many people had participated in that. Many people saw that violence as integral to what the country was. So there was a pretty well-established tradition of settling differences violently.
I'm sure you're familiar with Stephen Hahn's book, A Liberal America. He teaches at NYU, a book which in some ways is very similar to yours, but covers all of American history. Hahn was recently on the Ezra Klein show, talking like we're talking today, Adam, about the very American roots of Trumpism. Hahn, it's an interesting book, traces much of this back to Jackson and the wars of the frontier against Indians. Do you share his thesis on that front? Are there strong similarities between Jackson, Wilson, and perhaps even Trump?
Well, I regret to say I'm not familiar with Hahn's book, but I certainly do feel that that legacy of constant war for most of the 19th century against the Native Americans ran very deep in this country. And we must never forget how appealing it is to young men to take part in war. Unfortunately, all through history, there have been people very tempted by this. And I think when you have wars of conquest, such as happened in the American West, against people who are more poorly armed, or colonial wars, such as Europe fought in Africa and Asia against much more poorly armed opponents, these are especially appealing to young people. And in both the United States and in the European colonization of Africa, say, which I know something about, for young men joining in these colonizing or conquering adventures, there was a chance not just to get martial glory, but to also get rich in the process.
Yeah, you're all too familiar with colonial history, Adam. Another of your books was about King Leopold's Congo and the brutality there. Where was the most coherent opposition, morally and politically, to what was happening? My sense in Trump's America is perhaps the most persuasive and moral critique comes from the old Republican center, from people like David Brooks, Peter Wayno, who's been on the show many times, Jonathan Rauch. Where were people like Teddy Roosevelt in this narrative? Yeah. Were there critics from the right as well as from the left?
Good question. I first of all would give a shout out to those Republican centrists who've spoken out against Trump. The McCain Republicans, a lot of them, right? And there's some good people there.
Or Romney, of course, as well.
They've been very, very forceful. There wasn't really an equivalent to that, a direct equivalent to that in the Wilson era. Teddy Roosevelt, whom you mentioned, was a far more ferocious drumbeater than Wilson himself, and was pushing Wilson to declare war long before Wilson did. Roosevelt really believed that war was good for the soul. He desperately tried to get Wilson to appoint him to lead a volunteer force, came up with an elaborate plan for this would be a volunteer army staffed by descendants of both Union and Confederate generals and by French officers as well, and homage to the Marquis de Lafayette. But Wilson refused to allow Roosevelt to do this, and plus Roosevelt was, I think, 58 years old at the time. But all four of Roosevelt's sons enlisted, joined in the war, and one of them was killed. And his father was absolutely devastated by this. So there was not really that equivalent to the McCain Republicans who were resisting Trump, so to speak. In fact, what resistance there was in the U.S. came mostly from the left, and it was mostly ruthlessly silenced, all these people who went to jail. It was silenced also because, this is another important part of what happened, which is different from today. When the federal government passed the Espionage Act that gave it these draconian powers, state governments, many of them passed copycat laws. In fact, a federal Justice Department agent actually helped draft the law in New Hampshire. Montana locked up people for, there was a total, I mentioned it in the article, but I don't remember the figure, serving more than 60 years cumulatively at hard labor for opposing the war. California had 70 people in prison. Even my hometown of Berkeley, California, passed a copycat law. So this martial spirit really spread throughout the country at that time.
So you've mentioned that Debs was the great critic and was imprisoned and got considerable number of votes in the election. You're writing a book now about the Great Depression and FDR's involvement in it. FDR, of course, was a distant cousin of Teddy Roosevelt. At this point, he was, an aspiring Democratic politician. Where was the critique within the mainstream Democratic Party? Were people like FDR, who was he held a position in the Wilson administration? Yeah. Wasn't he Naval Secretary?
He was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And, he went to Europe during the war. For an aspiring politician, it's always very important to say, I've been at the front. And so he went to Europe during the war and certainly made no sign of resistance. And then in 1920, he was the Democratic candidate for vice president. That ticket lost, of course.
And just to remind ourselves, this was before he became disabled through polio. Is that correct?
That's right. That happened in the early 20s, and it completely changed his life, and I think quite deepened him as a person. He was a very ambitious, social climbing young politician before then, but I think he became something deeper. Also, the political parties at the time were divided, each party, between right and left wings, or warmongering and pacifist wings. And when the Congress voted on the war, there were 6 senators who voted against going to war and 50 members of the House of Representatives. And those senators and representatives came from both parties. We think of the Republican Party as being more conservative, but it had some staunch liberals in it. The most outspoken voice against the war in the Senate was Robert La Follette of Wisconsin, who was a Republican.
Yeah, and I know you write about La Follette in American Midnight, but couldn't one, Adam, be for the war and against domestic repression? You wrote an interesting piece recently for the New York Review of Books about the Scopes trial. William Bryan Jennings, of course, was involved in that. He was the defeated Democratic candidate, in about 3 or 4 presidential elections in the early 20th century. What was Bryan's position on this? He had been against the war, is that correct? But I'm guessing he would have been quite critical of some of the domestic repression.
I should know the answer to that, Andrew, but I don't. He certainly was against going to war. He had started out in Wilson's first term as Wilson's Secretary of State, and then resigned in protest against the military buildup and what he saw as a drift to war. And I give him great credit for that. I don't recall his speaking out against the repression after it began once the U.S. entered the war, but I could be wrong on that. It was not something that I researched. There were just so few voices speaking out. I think I would remember if he had been one of them.
Adam, again, I'm thinking out loud here, so please correct me if this is a dumb question. But would it be fair to say that one of the things that distinguished the United States from the European powers, that during the First World War, in this period, it remained an incredibly insular provincial place, barely involved in international politics, with a population, many of them were migrants themselves who had come from Europe, but nonetheless cut off from the world. And much of that accounted for the anti-immigrant, anti-foreign hysteria that exists in many countries, but perhaps it was a little bit more pronounced in the America of the early 20th century, and perhaps in some ways in the early 21st century.
Well, we remain a pretty insular place.
That's what I meant, yeah.
World in many ways. A few years ago, I remember seeing the statistic in the New York Times. I have not checked to see whether it's still the case, but I suspect it is, that half the members of the United States Congress do not have passports. And, it's we are more cut off from the world than people living in most of the countries of Europe, for example. And I think that does account for some of the tremendous feeling against immigrants and refugees. Although, of course, this is something that is common not just in Europe, but in many countries all over the world. And I fear it's going to get all the stronger as climate change generates more and more refugees from the center of the earth going to places farther north or farther south where they can get away from parts of the world that have become almost unlivable because of climate change.
Yeah, I wonder, Democratic Congress people perhaps aren't leaving the country because they fear they won't be let back in. What were the concrete consequences of all this? You write in your book about a young lawyer, J. Edgar Hoover, of course, who made his name in this period. He was very much involved in the Palmer raids. He worked, I think his first job was for Palmer. How do you see this structurally? Of course, many historians, biographers of Hoover have seen this as the beginning of some sort of American security state. Is that overreading it, exaggerating what happened in this period?
Well, security state may be too dignified a word for the hysteria that reigned in the country at that time. One of the things we've long had in the United States is a hysteria, paranoia directed at immigrants who are coming from what seems to be a new and threatening part of the world. In the mid-19th century, for example, we had the Know Nothing Party, as it was called, who were violently opposed to Catholic immigrants coming from Ireland. Now, they were people of Anglo-Saxon descent, pretty much, who felt that these Irish Catholics were a tremendous threat to the America that they knew. There was much violence. There were people killed in riots against Catholic immigrants. There were Catholic merchants who had their stores burned and so on. Then it began to shift. The Irish sort of became acceptable, but by the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, the immigrants coming from Europe were now coming primarily from Southern and Eastern Europe. In other words, Italians, Sicilians, Poles, and Jews. And they became the target of the anti-immigrant crusaders with much hysteria directed against them. It was further inflamed at that time by the eugenics movement, which was something very, very strong, where people believed that there was a Nordic race that was somehow superior to everybody else, that the Mediterraneans were inferior people, and that the Africans were so far down the scale, barely worth talking about. And this culminated in 1924 with the passage of the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act that year, which basically slammed the door completely on immigrants coming from Asia and slowed to an absolute trickle those coming from Europe for the next 40 years or so.
Yeah, it wasn't. It was the mid '60s that the immigration change, which is often overlooked. Some people, even on the left, suggest that it was a mistake to radically reform the Immigration Act because we would inevitably found ourselves back in this situation. And what you think about that, Adam?
Well, I think we do. I think a country has the right to regulate to some degree its immigration, but there always will be immigration in this world. I mean, my ancestors all came from other countries. The Jewish side of my family, I'm half Jewish, were lucky to get out of Europe in plenty of time. Some relatives who stayed there were not lucky and perished in the Holocaust. So who am I to say that somebody, fleeing a repressive regime in El Salvador or somewhere else doesn't have the right to come here? I think we should be pretty tolerant, especially if people fleeing countries where they really risk death for one reason or another. But there is always going to be this strong anti-immigrant feeling because, unscrupulous politicians like Donald Trump, and he has many, many predecessors in this country, can point to immigrants and blame them for the economic misfortunes that many Americans are experiencing for reasons that don't have anything to do with immigration.
Let's fast forward, Adam, to today. You were involved in an interesting conversation on The Nation about the role of universities in the resistance. What do you make of this first 100 years? I was going to say 100 years. That would be a Freudian error. 100 days of the Trump regime, the role of big law, big universities, newspapers, media outlets in this emerging opposition. Are you chilled or encouraged?
Yeah, well, I hope it's 100 days and not 100 years.
Yeah, so do I.
I am moderately encouraged. I was certainly deeply disappointed at the outset to see, all of those tech titans go to Washington, kiss the ring, contribute to Trump's inauguration festivities, be there in the front row. A very, very depressing spectacle, which kind of reminds one of how all the big German industrialists fell into line so quickly behind Hitler. And I'm particularly depressed to see the changes in the media. Both the Los Angeles Times and the Washington Post becoming much more tame when it came to, endorsing.
I think one of the reasons for that, Adam, of course, is that you're a long-time professor at the journalism school at UC Berkeley, so you've been on the front lines of this.
Yeah. So I really care about a lively press that has free expression. And, we also have a huge part of the media, like Fox News and One American Network and other outlets that are just pouring forth a constant fire hose of lies and falsehoods.
And you're being kind at calling it a fire hose. I think we could come up with other terms for it.
A Niagara.
Yeah.
Anyway.
A sewage pipe, but that's another issue.
But I'm encouraged when I see media organizations that, take a stand. There are places like the New York Times, like CNN, like MSNBC, like the major TV networks, which you can read or watch and really find an honest picture of what's going on. And I think that's a tremendously important thing for a country to have. And that you look at the countries that Donald Trump admires, like Putin's Russia, for example, they don't have this. So I value that. I want to keep it. I think that's tremendously important. I was sorry, of course, that so many of those big law firms immediately caved to these ridiculous and unprecedented demands that he made. Contributing pro bono work to his causes in return for not getting banned from government buildings. Nothing like that has happened in American history before. And the people in those firms that made those decisions should really be ashamed of themselves. I was glad to see Harvard University, which happens to be my alma mater, be defiant after caving in a little bit on a couple of issues. They finally put their foot down and said no. And I must say, feeling Harvard patriotism is a very rare emotion for me. But this is the first time in 50 years that I've felt some of it. And
you may even give a donation, Adam.
I hope other universities are going to follow its lead, and it looks like they will. But this is pretty unprecedented. A president coming after universities with this determined a ferocity. And he's going after nonprofit organizations as well. There will be many fights there as well. I'm sure we're just waiting to hear about the next wave of attacks, which will be on places like the Ford Foundation and the Carnegie Corporation and other, big nonprofits. So hold on and wait for that. And I hope they are as defiant as possible too.
Yeah, it's a little bit jarring to hear a wise historian like yourself use the word unprecedented. Uh, is there much else of this, given that we're talking historically and the similarities with the period after the First World War? Is there anything else unprecedented about Trumpism?
Well, I think in a way, that we have often had, or not often, but certainly sometimes had presidents in this country who wanted to assume almost dictatorial powers. Richard Nixon certainly is the most recent case before Trump, and he was eventually, stopped and forced to leave office. Had that not happened, I think he would have very happily turned himself into a dictator. So we know that there are temptations that come with the desire for absolute power everywhere. But Trump has gotten farther along on this process and has shown less willingness to, do things like abide by court orders, to the way that, for example, that he puts pressure on Republican members of Congress. To me, one of the most startling, disappointing, remarkable, and shocking things about these first 100 days is how very few Republican members of the House or Senate have dared to defy Trump on anything. At most, these ridiculous set of appointees that he muscled through the Senate, at most, they got 3 Republican votes against them. They couldn't muster the 4th necessary vote. And in the House, only 1 or 2 Republicans have voted against Trump on anything. And of course, he has threatened to have Elon Musk fund primaries against any member of Congress who does defy him. And I can't help but think that these folks must also be afraid of physical violence, because Trump has let all the January 6th people out of jail. And the way vigilantes like that operate is they first go after the traitors on their own side, then they come for the rest of us. Just as in the first real burst of violence in Hitler's Germany was the Night of the Long Knives against another faction of the Nazi Party. Then they started coming for the Jews.
Finally, Adam, your wife Arlie is another very distinguished writer. She been on the show.
A better picture of her than that one, though.
Yeah, well, I got some very nice photos. This one is perhaps a little. Well, she's thinking, Adam. Everyone knows Arlie from her hugely successful work, Strangers in Their Own Land. She has a new book out, Stolen Pride, Lost Shame, and the Rise of the Right. I don't want to put words into Arlie's mouth, and she certainly wouldn't let me do that, Adam. But would it be fair to say that her reading, certainly of recent American history, is trying to bring people back together? She talks about the lessons she learned from her therapist brother. And in some ways, I see her as a kind of marriage counselor in America. Given what's happening today in America with Trump, is this still an opportunity? This thing is going to end, and it will end in some ways rather badly and perhaps bloodily, one way or the other. But is there still a way to bring Americans back together? Can America be reunited? What can we learn from American Midnight? I mean, one of the more encouraging stories I remember, and please correct me if I'm wrong, wasn't it Coolidge or Harding who invited Debs when he left prison to the White House? So American history might be in some ways violent, but it's also made up of chapters of forgiveness.
That's true. I mean, that Debs Harding example is a wonderful one. Here is Debs, sent to prison by Woodrow Wilson for a 10-year term. And Debs, by the way, had been in jail before for his leadership of a railway strike when he was a railway workers union organizer. Labor organizing was a very dangerous profession in those days. But Debs was a very gentle man, deeply committed to nonviolence. About a little less than a year into his term, Warren Harding, Woodrow Wilson's successor, pardoned Debs, let him out of prison, invited him to visit the White House on his way home. And they had a half-hour's chat. And when he left the building, Debs told reporters, I've run for the White House 5 times, but this is the first time I've actually gotten here. And Harding privately told a friend, this was revealed only after his death, that he said, Debs was right about that war. We never should have gotten involved in it. So, yeah, there can be reconciliation. There can be talk across these great differences that we have. And I think, there are a number of organizations that are working on that specific project, getting
people. We've done many of those shows. I'm sure you're familiar with the organization Braver Angels, which seems to do a very good job.
So I think it can be done. I really think it can be done, and it has to be done. And it's important, for those of us who are as deeply worried about Trump as you and I are, to understand the grievances and the losses and the suffering that has made Trump's backers feel that here is somebody who can get them out of the pickle that they're in. We have to understand that. And the Democratic Party has to come up with promising alternatives for them, which it really has not done. It didn't really offer one in this last election. And the party itself is in complete disarray right now, I fear.
Yeah, I think perhaps Arlie should run for president. She certainly did a better job than Kamala Harris in explaining it. And of course, they're both from Berkeley. Finally, Adam, you're very familiar with the history of Africa, Southern Africa. Your family, I think, was originally from there. Might we need, after all this, when hopefully the smoke clears, might we need a Mandela-style truth and reconciliation committee to make sense of what's happened?
Yeah. My family's actually not from there, but they were in business there at one point.
Right. They were in the mining business, weren't they?
That's right. A Truth and Reconciliation Committee. Well, I don't think it would be on quite the same model as South Africa's, but I certainly think we need to find some way of talking across the differences that we have. And coming from the left side of that divide, I just feel all too often when I'm talking to people who feel as I do about the world, that there is a kind of contempt or disinterest in Trump's backers. These are people that I want to understand, that we need to understand. We need to understand them in order to hear what their real grievances are and to develop alternative policies that are going to give them a real alternative to vote for. Unless we can do that, we're going to have Trump and his like for a long time, I fear.
Wise words, Adam. I hope in the next 500 episodes of this show, things will improve. We'll get you back on the show. Keep doing your important work, and I'm very excited to learn more about your new project, which we'll come to in the next few months or certainly years. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Good being with you.
Can I step on the sea?